Okay. Okay. We'll make a little bit of a start then. We have still got a couple of people just still dropping in, which is brilliant. It is being recorded as well, so don't panic if you do have to drop off or if you're not available for the whole piece. It will be getting circulated and distributed to you as well. So, yes, thank you everyone for joining us today. Joining Luke and I. Today we're going to be talking about catastrophizing. So, title is Understanding and Managing Catastrophizing in the Workplace. So, just a little bit of housekeeping. Your microphones will be switched off. There will be opportunity for Q&A, quick question and answer, towards the end. So, do feel free, absolutely, to put any questions into the chat function or the Q&A function as we go along. So, what are we going to look at today? We're going to introduce ourselves, so you know who we are and what we do. And then Luke's going to talk about what is catastrophizing, who might be likely to catastrophize and why that's a problem, and then looking at what we can do about it, which I think is incredibly important, recognizing and then reacting. And then there's lots of useful tools that Luke will be able to introduce you to as well. So I'm here today. Thank you for having me again. I'm a Clinical Operations Director for PAM Physio Solutions. I'm a physiotherapist by background. I've been a physio for over 20 years and I've been in occupational health for nearly 15 years. I have a very special passion around ergonomics, and that's about the correct movement and performing activities efficiently, and it really links in really neatly with catastrophizing. And Luke, I'll hand over to Luke and let Luke introduce himself.
Hi everyone, so my name's Luke. I'm an operations lead for PAM, which sounds a little bit fancier than what it is potentially. I'm essentially a senior MSK clinician, so I treat solely pains, things like osteoarthritis, back pain, shoulder pain, things like that, in an occupational health setting. Previously working more specifically with chronic pain, and that's where I developed my fascination with it and a passion for learning more about some of the things that can contribute towards painful conditions, which leads us nicely to talk about catastrophizing, which is just one small segment of a large, very fascinating topic. So I suppose we've heard of catastrophizing in many different ways, many different facets of our life. Catastrophizing was brought into our awareness around 1960s, and it kind of embodied a switch of how we approached health conditions. Historically, we've worked solely with something called the biomedical model. And what that means is that there's a problem and you solve that problem. And that's great. And it works for the majority of things, especially acute problems. Think a broken leg, you have a surgery and it fixes itself. Very biomedical. You think of certain medications, most surgeries that we have, and it's fascinating and it's great. But where the biomedical model falls short is with these more chronic, longer term conditions, like pain, for example, where we notice that there's a lot more to it than just a see a problem, solve that problem approach. It was initially defined as a response to stress and anxiety, and some individuals focus on the negative aspects of a situation and expect the worst outcome, which is quite wordy, but I think that it summarizes it really quite well. It's then over time become more and more concise, an extreme instance of worrying, dwelling on the worst possible outcomes of any situation in which there's a possibility of an unpleasant outcome, and more recently, very simply, repetitive negative thinking. And we can all probably think of a time in our life where we've catastrophized over something where we've expected the worst case scenario, and most of the time that's not happened. There's a really nice analogy that describes catastrophizing, which says that it's like a natural disaster where the amount of casualties go beyond what the medical teams can cope with. And it's a bit like that in our own mind, where the problem that we're faced with surpasses our own internal capacity to deal with that problem. And that can be quite problematic. In our field, mine and Claire's, over the last 20, 30 years, it has been focused on more with pain catastrophizing, where it's exactly the same thing, but painful conditions can just become blown up and we can kind of overestimate the threat that this painful stimulus is giving us. So how might we see this in individuals? And we might see this in individuals by what if thinking, which we've all had. What if this happens? What if that happens? As well as, if this happens, there's no way I'd be able to deal with it. I just hope and I pray that this thing doesn't happen. And we kind of build up the effects and the causes of all of these things that could potentially happen in our day-to-day life. Moving on to why people catastrophize, and this is really quite an interesting topic, from way beyond my scope of practice, way beyond my understanding, with certain changes in brain structure and function. That's a bit like the chicken or the egg. We don't really know whether the brain changes happen and then as a consequence people catastrophize, or the catastrophizing happens, therefore the brain changes happen. So it's a little bit challenging to determine that. Again, even more complicated, we've got certain behavior models. So there's behavior inhibiting systems, behavior appreciating systems. Essentially, people who are more inhibited by nature, people who are more reserved, people who like to think things over before making an action, as averse to people are like try it and see, may be more likely to catastrophize just because of their makeup. You might, categorize yourself as being a little bit of a worrier, and that then would predispose you to catastrophize about things more so than other people might. There's also kind of complex socioeconomic things that contribute towards people catastrophizing. It's been shown that children whose parents catastrophize are more likely to catastrophize themselves, and they're placed at more of a higher risk. There's also things like the nature of the work that you do, the environment in your workplace, that can all contribute towards the level of catastrophizing that you have. Really interesting, there are more theoretical models, like a communal coping response. Sometimes people subconsciously catastrophize an issue because it leads to them getting more support at home. This isn't something that people do naturally. This is something that's totally subconscious, and it's almost a learned behavior where people they talk about their back pain more, for example, and their husband magically does the housework because the husband doesn't want them to do to bend over a lot and injure the back further, or the children help out around a lot more, or your wife will start to do the school run because you talk about how painful it is. And then people learn that behavior as a way of avoiding the things that are painful for them, and it can just go round and round in a circle and magnify from there, which is quite interesting. Sometimes your previous medical history and your medical involvements you might feel like you need to catastrophize in medical appointments because you don't feel like your doctor's listening to you or taking you seriously. Adversely, you might have experienced overtreatment for medical issues where you've been sent for every investigation and nothing comes up, and your medical practitioner becomes quite frustrated by this, and their eagerness to help and their worry about you translates to worry about what's going on in yourself as well. Complexly as well, there are other things where it can help us to manage our pain. And if we look at the biopsychosocial model, which I touched on before, it can really emphasize these things where it impacts all the areas of our health, not just our biological. And if we talk about a painful condition, for example, people might say, okay, if I prepare myself and I tell myself exactly what's going to cause my pain all the time, and I prepare for it and I avoid it and I'm totally on top of it, it's going to help. But actually it can have a contrary effect where it turns out that you're constantly having to think about your pain in order to manage it that way, which can then lead you to catastrophize it. And that can be the same with any issues. So now we'll talk about the biopsychosocial effects of why these things happen, why these things are problematic, why it's not helpful to catastrophize. So if we focus initially on the biological elements, there's many different things that have been emphasized in research that has shown a negative impact of catastrophizing. For example, poorer physical functioning, a greater issue distinguishing actual pain issues that are a problem, reduced control over your pain, larger expectations of what the amount of effort that will be required of you from physical effort. So it's been shown in studies that people who catastrophize see certain hills as being steeper than people that don't catastrophize, for example. The world around you changes as a result, where everything seems like it's going to be more challenging. We've also seen increased levels of disability and pain intensity, more specifically to work, things that we feel like we have to be at a certain level of conditioning, a certain reduced level of pain in order to return to work safely. And if we don't, we might fret over re-injury more. Higher levels of pain intensity and longer lengths for recovery, increased input from medical professionals, and also a reduced self-efficacy, which is really important to be aware of. And I doubt you'll have heard of that term before, but self-efficacy essentially means your ability to just rumble on despite what's going on in your day-to-day life, almost like resilience. Another really interesting thing is that people who catastrophize tend to have a reduced ability to persist with painful activities and increased negative emotions associated with pain, which can be really difficult to manage. And again, just to reiterate, this isn't the catastrophizer's fault. This isn't something that people are doing consciously. This is totally subconsciously. And I'd just like to, at this point, remove that level of blame from that person. This person doesn't want to catastrophize. This person doesn't want to be in higher levels of pain. This is just something that happens as a consequence of how we feel about things moving forward. And we can see on the right hand side of your screen how this can impact. We have a painful event, we think about the worst case scenario, we're faced with overwhelming emotions, as anybody would be, which causes us significant distress and then leads to elevated pain levels. And it can be a little bit like a vicious cycle. Moving on to discuss about the psychological elements, there is something called the fear avoidance cycle, which can be quite perpetual, if you like, and again, never ending. We have a painful event. We interpret that pain as meaning that we're damaged, or this thing is bad for us or wrong. That then increases our awareness, how we feel about our body, increases the threat associated with those specific tasks. So we attempt to avoid that further. Because we attempt to avoid all the things that cause us pain, our physical functioning reduced. And then because our physical functioning reduces, we have an increased sensitivity to everything, and our ability to cope with these things is then reduced physiologically. And we keep going round and round and round in this cycle. And that can be very problematic, not just, again, biologically to our structures reducing the capacity, but if you imagine somebody doesn't feel able to keep up with their social demands, psychologically, the effect that can have on the mood can be catastrophic. This can potentially be why many people who suffer from catastrophizing are more likely to have depression and more likely to have social anxiety, which can be very problematic and again complicate the dealing with this initial pain problem. Is no longer just a pain problem. It's a problem with everything in your day-to-day life, which can be really difficult to manage. And finally, touching on the social aspect of this biopsychosocial model, again, as a bit of a tangent, this is more of an easier way to take this in. We wouldn't like to separate biopsychosocial, as we know from what we discussed already. These things are all one, they're all linked, and it's impossible to separate them out. A bit like if you're making a cake, you've made your cake, you can't then take the eggs back out. And that's a good way to think about your overall health. But socially, again, the effect of catastrophizing can be large. One of the largest things at work is for an individual to actually communicate what they feel like they need from their employer And if we get into a routine of catastrophizing, we can then really worry about the effects of your employer. If you have that conversation, oh, my manager's not going to like me anymore. They're not going to want to put up with me at work. I'm going to lose my job. And all of these thoughts can spiral and make these conversations that for many seem very normal and doable, really quite challenging. And then so you can see in the graphic on the right hand side, can lead to reduced social integration, reduced implementation of your hobbies, reduced confidence, and reduced communication skills, leading to an increased pain levels, increased isolation, increased levels of disability, and increased depression. So at this point, this all sounds really quite overwhelming. What can we do about this situation? Is there anything that we can? And I like to separate what we can do about it into two separate sections. So we've got action, taking action towards what we want, and education about what's actually going on at the time. Again, to emphasize what I discussed earlier, these things aren't the individual's fault. This isn't something that somebody wants to do. This isn't something that somebody's doing for benefit. This is something that's all happening subconsciously. And we often can't see the impact of that when we're looking at it ourselves. Part of becoming aware of that is through education. Things like CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and mindfulness-based techniques have all been shown to be very useful in bringing about our awareness of these things. But it doesn't just stop with the person. I think that education needs to pass on to health professionals. There's lots of studies that are done that are really quite worrying. Many health professionals not being aware of the biopsychosocial model of health, many training courses not covering evidence-based things about painful conditions more specifically, which can be really difficult. Again, through education, we can start to develop more positive communication styles where we can then truly start to empathize with people rather than just sympathizing with them, rather than saying things like, oh, that must be awful. Instead, look how resilient you are to have got to this point despite what's going on. Using really positive terminology so that we can then start to make a positive change and start to see people see the other side, not just what's going to happen if the worst case scenario does happen. A great way of doing this is through the 5-point model. Again, I don't expect any of you to have heard of this before, but this can be a really useful tool. And I'm going to take you through a general example that we have, that all of us will have faced, an incident related to a painful condition, and then an incident related to a work-related catastrophizing issue outside of a painful condition. So let's say something that we've all faced, we're stuck in traffic. And I'm sure if I was to ask you to write in the chat box, what are some of the emotions that you suffer with when you're stuck in traffic? They might not represent your character the best. I know certainly for me it doesn't. You're thinking, oh, what's going on? Why is this happening? What idiots caused this? Your behaviours might be frantic. You might bang on your steering wheel, have road rage. All of these crazy things might happen that are totally out of character. As a result of that, how do you feel? We feel overwhelmed, stressed, frustrated, anxious. And how does our body look? What are our physical symptoms like? We're sweating, we're hypervigilant, our blood pressure might even be raised. All of this is linked. But then when we think about the 5-point model, we look at these 4 options here. What are 2 of the main things that we can focus on controlling from this perspective? We can't really control our feelings and we can't really control our physical symptoms. Those are a little bit outside of our control. Our feelings and our physical symptoms are a consequence of our thoughts and our behaviors. We can always control our behaviors. We can't always control our initial thoughts, but we can certainly be mindful and we can adapt and we can change that over time. So again, these techniques aren't magic. These techniques can't make you not be annoyed initially when you're stuck in traffic if you're in a rush to be somewhere. But what they can do is they can make being in traffic not ruin the rest of your day, and instead just ruin those initial 5 minutes. So instead of thinking, oh my gosh, I'm stuck in traffic, we can think, I'm in my car, I'm safe. It's going to take me however long I'm going to get there. If we think this, we might be able to control our behaviors. We can pull over safely, we can call work and we can let them know that we're going to be late and there's nothing that we can do about it. We can put our favorite radio station on or our favorite podcast while we're in the car while we're waiting. If we think about this alternate world where instead our thoughts are more taking control of what we can do when we're thinking about the actual situation and we're accepting the situation that we're in, what's the consequence of that? How do our feelings shape up and how our body responds to that? If instead we're sat in a car listening to our favorite we're listening to our favorite podcast, that's really important. It can change our feelings because we feel comfortable, we feel accepted, we're learning something and we feel engrossed in that podcast, and our physical symptoms aren't all as high as a result of that. Another thing to point about this situation is that it's not being in traffic that makes you angry, it's the environment of when you're stuck in traffic. Because if we think about if we've been stuck in traffic in the past where we're really early to get somewhere and it's raining outside, it's miserable weather, and instead we're sat in our car with the heating on, we don't feel so frustrated about being stuck in traffic. So always being aware of the environmental impact of how we feel as well is really important, and controlling our environment, which is something which we'll come on to in a little bit as well. Let's now touch on a painful episode, okay? So we have our first episode of lower back pain. Our thoughts are, this is really painful. This is not ideal. But they could also be for somebody that catastrophizes, oh my goodness, my mum needed 4 operations on her back. This is the start of me needing these 4 operations. I've got my mum's back. And then as a result of that, our behaviors are altered because we don't feel confident in the strength in our back. So our behaviors, we rest and for the first couple of weeks, but then even when our back pain goes away, this acute aspect, we still have behaviors in line with having our mum's back and not wanting to bend down and pick something up, being avoidant of things that we feel might contribute towards our back pain. That way, we always feel overwhelmed. We always feel like our back's weak. We always feel out of control of our condition, and our physical symptoms are that everything again is heightened and we're hypervigilant. Being aware of the wider environment of all this is something that we've touched on. We've got a background situation here of our mum having a history of back problems that we feel like we've inherited. And in the background, again, our environment's changing because we previously enjoyed going to the gym and we were previously building up to our 1 rep max on a deadlift or to run a 5K or to run a half marathon, but we now feel unable to do that because of the environment. You've spoken to somebody and they've said, oh, you shouldn't run with a bad back, that puts far too much pressure on your spine. So we've stopped running. And all of this all influences what we can do. So instead, of course, does this mean if we're aware of the 5-point model that we get an episode of acute lower back pain and we say, oh, yay, thank goodness, and our initial thought is that I'm so glad that I'm in pain? Of course not. We're still going to be worried, but our thoughts are instead, my back's resilient, my back's strong. It's very normal for people to have back pain and recover and be absolutely fine. Just because my mum had back pain forever doesn't mean that I'm going to have back pain forever. Our behaviors, we might then seek a medical appointment who advises us to rest up, wait for the pain to go back, and then gradually start moving once it's less acute. And we feel confident with that movement because the medical professionals advise us to do so. We then start to feel more in control of our situation, and our physical symptoms all reduce as a consequence of that. Now, of course, this is all very rosy, these examples, and they're not likely to be as simple as that, but you can see the framework of what we're working with here. Finally, if we touch on a work-related event, our manager calls us for an urgent meeting. They pop up on Teams and they say, Luke, I need to speak to you urgently. Our initial thoughts might be, what have I done wrong? I'm going to get sacked. We've all probably been in this position before. Our behaviors as a result, we avoid the consultation, or we go into the consultation with our backup, and we're quite confrontational about that because we're feeling overwhelmed. Again, we're feeling at threat, we're feeling what's the word, challenged and undermined. So our physical symptoms, our anxiety is high, we feel threatened, so our blood pressure, everything goes up, as with all the other examples. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes. If you pop in the chat function, what are some alternative thoughts, or if you've experienced this in the past, how you get around this situation? What are some alternative thoughts that we could have going into that meeting? This might be really useful for people that don't catastrophize, and some of the initial thoughts that you would have that helps you to not catastrophize in, even if it is subconscious. I'll just give it 30 seconds, and if there's no responses, then I'll just crack on. Try and consider the previous options that we've done. So going into this meeting, we might think, oh, Claire might be busy. She's in a meeting. She's just had to pop this message quickly. It doesn't mean that I've done anything wrong. As a result, our behavior, and then we might think, actually, our behaviors might be, right, as a result, let's try to focus on how we can prepare for this meeting the most effectively. And our feelings, again, we feel more control, and we feel our anxiety and our depression, our stress is all reduced as a result of that. So again, just to reiterate, trying to be aware of our thoughts, trying to be aware of our behaviors as initial response to this can help us to be in control and as effective as we possibly can be. Yeah, that's a good example about Claire, thinking about something positive that you can bring to the meeting. And then the other way that we can change or adapt, whether we catastrophize or not, is to highlight that, is to be aware through action that our past experiences might be difficult or might be tainted based on our experiences of pain or of other things. If we have a bad experience with a communication with our manager, we then have an understanding that the next time we speak to the manager, we are going to worry about that a little bit more. And instead, there's an analogy. I'm by no means a medical practitioner, but if a ship's out at sea, it can't change the storm. It can't change how high the waves are, but instead it can change its navigation to keep itself safe from capsizing. And that's sometimes what we have to do. We can put things in place in our initial actions to reduce the effect that our increased anxiety and stress has on us when preparing for those meetings. We can sit down and we can prepare things that we can mention to our manager to help us with having those communications and certain points that we might want to bring up in a professional manner. We can also, through action, there's something called graded exposure. We can introduce ourselves at a lower level of the example, at a lower level of the hobby that we want to be doing. Let's say we wanted to run a half marathon, we have an injury, and we catastrophize that we're not going to be able to run that half marathon without another injury. We can start by running a mile and then walking a little bit, and running a mile and then walking a little bit, and gaining our love back for running as a primary, and then building back from a place where we feel safe and we feel secure in that, where we're doing the thing that we enjoy. We've mentioned before, and again, bringing this back about controlling the environment, there's a huge amount of evidence that suggests that optimizing your environment when you're doing activities that we feel threatened by can be really positive. It can help us with persisting with painful activities. It can also help us with reintegrating previously painful activities into our routine. So things like putting our favorite music on, being with our favorite people, our family or our friends when we do it. If a physio gives you an exercise program, don't do it by yourself, locked away. Get your kids involved and get them all involved. Make it an enjoyable task that you can all face together. And then the final thing that I wanted to touch on was looking after yourself. If you yourself catastrophize and you're aware of that, what are some of the things that you can do to prepare? We touched on this, preparing for conversations with your employer, having a script or something like that to help you with saying the things that you want to be able to say, discussing it with loved ones and making yourself as prepared for those conversations as you can. But then on the flip side, if you're a manager, you're aware that one of your team catastrophize, it's important for you to not blame that person for catastrophizing. It's not something that we do on purpose. It's something that's totally subconscious. Also, it's important for you going into that conversation with somebody that catastrophizes to be able to debrief from that. Not necessarily to tell somebody about a confidential matter, but instead to have 5 minutes away from your desk after these difficult meetings or difficult conversations so that you can then prepare for the rest of your day and avoid burnout. Consider, I know something that's big within PAM, the company that I work for, not just having all of your meetings at your desk, again, optimizing your environment. I know it's probably not going to be nice outside for a while, but going out for a walk if it is nice outside, even if it's cold, but just being out and about, changing your environment so you're not just sat at your desk behind your computer all the time when you're having your one-to-ones or you're engaging with people. Thank you very much for listening to me speak about catastrophizing. Hopefully you've been able to take something away from it. If there are any other anything else that you wanted to take away, there are some really useful resources. There's a website online where you can access decatastrophizing tools, worksheets, and things like that. It doesn't actually say the website there. It's called positivepsychology.com. So you can access that. There's also the Rails Wellbeing and the PAM Life apps that you can use as well that have loads and loads of useful resources on there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Luke. Really, really insightful and really, really interesting. I'm sure everyone will agree. So the presentation will be circulated, and we just want to give you the opportunity to pop any questions that you might have into the chat function. We'll give you a few minutes to do that, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. So in the meantime, whilst you're all hopefully thinking up some really good questions for us to challenge us, I'd like to share this slide with you. There's a link in here to our website, and that holds a plethora of downloadable resources, blogs, videos, useful guides, leaflets, booklets, podcasts, and it also exhibits our service provision as well. So please do feel free to have a look at that. And as I said, these slides will be shared with everyone that's joined today, so you can have a look at that too. And while we get some questions through, I've just popped up a final slide that invites you to join our mailing list. That'll allow you to receive all of our latest news and updates and invites to free events and webinars. And again, there's a nice volume of supporting material to help you with your health and wellbeing and support your colleagues and workforces as well. Well, no questions have come through yet, Luke, so you might be having a bit of a lucky one here. I was hoping for something really challenging and interesting to come through, but we will give it a few more minutes, and Luke and I will be here if anyone does have any questions and wants to ask anything. But thank you again for joining us. I'll just pop that on there as well. I've just got a few messages of thanks coming through there for you, Luke, as well. Right, looks like there's not going to be any questions coming through, so what we'll do, we'll probably just turn this off. Can't see anyone typing either. That's a shame. You must have done such a good job, Luke, there of answering everyone's questions during the actual webinar. So well done for that. Brilliant. Oh, excellent. Here we go. I've got a question through here from Jill. So do you work with your EAP colleagues on strategies to support clients who catastrophize? There's a long answer and a short answer to that. I'd say the short answer is yes. We are not psychologists. We are not here to deliver and provide psychological services. So if someone needs that psychological support, then yes, they're absolutely signposted into the EAP. We'll do our piece when we can when it comes to the biopsychosocial approach in terms of rehabilitation. But for anyone that needs that extra layer of support, they're absolutely going to work with our EAP. Thank you. All right.